Guns are squarely at the top of President Obama's agenda tonight. 38 days after the tragedy at Newtown, he and Vice President Joe Biden met with police chiefs and sheriffs from cities across the country, including Newtown, Aurora, Colorado, and Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Joining me now are three men who were at that White House meeting: Commissioner Charles Ramsey of the Philadelphia Police Department, Chief John Edwards of Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and Sheriff Paul Fitzgerald of Story County, Iowa. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may start with you, let me start with you, if I may, please, Commissioner Ramsey. What was your overview of how the meeting went? And I suppose the key question is, what do you collectively think can actually be achieved here?
Well, I thought it was an excellent meeting, and it went beyond just the narrow topic of assault weapons into the broader topic of gun violence in general. We talked about the magazine capacities. We talked about universal background checks. Both the president and the vice president listened. They actually wanted suggestions. They're very, very serious about this. And I do think a lot can be accomplished. It's not going to be easy, but I do think a lot can be accomplished. And certainly the Major City Chiefs Organization, which I am the president of, as well as the Police Executive Research Forum, we stand firmly behind the president and vice president in their efforts to bring an end to this gun violence that we experience in our cities.
Let's play a clip from the president today. This is what he had to say.
No group is more important for us to listen to than our law enforcement officials. They're where rubber hits the road. And so I welcome this opportunity to work with them, to hear their views in terms of what would make the biggest difference to prevent something like Newtown or Oak Creek from happening again.
Police Chief Edwards, one of the things I keep hearing, and I've been hearing it for the last few days, is that the attempt to try and get a new assault weapons ban will flounder at the first hurdle because there's no political will in Washington for it to happen, which just strikes me as utterly extraordinary, given that the last 5 mass shootings in America have all involved assault rifles. Is there no way that the politicians can be compelled to get this through and act on behalf of the American people? Or is it true that the majority of American people don't really want one?
Well, from my personal perspective and what we dealt with and some of the things I've seen over 28 years in law enforcement, I personally don't think banning any weapon is going to stop the problem. I'm speaking from a position. I have been a victim of gun violence. Never once did I think that person who did it, we should look at the guns. He was a felon who shouldn't have had weapons. He was the person we should have looked at. There are many things in the proposals the president put forward that I think are fantastic. But it's one of the components of this entire discussion. We should discuss everything. We shouldn't be afraid to discuss everything. But there are other issues. We need to look down the road, not the ends to the means to the end, which are the weapons, but how these things start and where they develop, and try to identify people who might be predisposed to do this kind of violence. In law enforcement, day-to-day, officers see violence all the time. It doesn't always end with guns. I had an individual who beat a man and his mother to death with a baton and slit their throats. We need to look at the violence itself, not the tool, but the individual, and hold them responsible and look at what they're doing.
Sheriff Fitzgerald, I mean, there are many schools of thought about how best to tackle this, and many people agree background checks are a key part of this, more funding for mental health research and so on. But when I hear law enforcement officers, as I just heard there from the police chief, saying that basically, removing guns is never going to be any part of a solution, I do slightly step back and say, well, surely it has to help. I mean, what we've seen since Sandy Hook, for example, is a huge increase in guns and ammunition, as people race to buy them. I don't see how that helps reduce gun violence, do you?
Well, the problem that I see that we're missing here is we have a situation that, because we're talking about gun violence at the forefront, we're missing the issue that I think is really paramount throughout all of America, and that's the issue of mental health. Mental health support from Congress, the funding that county jails have seen all across America. We're seeing reductions in funding. We're seeing programs that we've been working, having some real success, going by the wayside. Throughout America, the sheriffs run the majority of the county jails. And in the county jails that you look in various counties, the majority of them, that's the largest mental health facility that there is.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much. It's been a busy day for you, and I know that we all share one common goal, which is to reduce the number of Americans who are killed by guns, and I appreciate you joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, New York's top cop, Ray Kelly, on the guns that he calls public enemy number one. New York's top cop says he agrees with the assault weapons ban, but he thinks that handguns are an even bigger problem. He's Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly, and he joins me now. Commissioner, thank you for joining me.
Good to be with you, Piers.
I read your op-ed piece in the New York Post with great interest. To me, there are a number of facets of this gun violence debate, and you've hit one squarely on the head today. Explain to me how you think the best way of dealing with the handgun issue could be going forward.
Well, when you say the best way, obviously you have to look at things that are possible. I think we need legislation, and probably the most realistic legislation that we can hope for is a universal background check. So I think even that may be a heavy lift in Congress. But there is this huge gaping hole in the system where about 40% of the guns that we see that are on the street are coming in some way, shape, or form through the so-called gun show loophole, which means basically that private sales are taking place and they're not recorded. But again, there's no easy answer to this problem. We know that for a long time to come, we're going to face the problem of illegal guns on the streets of New York and other major cities.
Do you see any reason why you need to have assault rifles in civilian hands generally?
I don't see a reason for it. It's certainly not needed for target shooting. I think General McChrystal, Stanley McChrystal, said it best. These are weapons of war, and they simply have no need to exist in a civilized society. It doesn't mean we're going to eliminate them anytime soon. I think most of the legislation that we're talking about is going to grandfather them in, even if that legislation goes forward. But in terms of need, no, I see no need. These are weapons that are made to kill other people, to kill large numbers of people in a very short period of time, and it's not logical as far as I'm concerned.
I read a very disturbing report today. The FBI came out and said that there were more background checks, official ones, made for guns in December following Sandy Hook than in any month in America since 1998. So there are more guns being purchased in December than in any month since 1998. And that just increases exponentially the sheer volume of weaponry on the street. And it's driven by fear from the gun rights lobbyists, NRA and others, that if everyone had been armed at Sandy Hook, at the school, they would have dealt with the shooter. How do you try and deal with that mentality in a reasonable way that doesn't offend gun owners, but actually works to reduce the total volume of guns rather than dramatically increase it?
The Second Amendment is here to stay, that people have a right to arms, they have a right to handguns within some reasonable regulations. And so I think you have to make people aware of the fact that, confiscation is not going to happen. The notion that if you armed a lot of people, that somehow it would deter crime or deter these attacks. I mean, also incumbent on them or on that approach would be that people receive an awful lot of training under a very stressful situation, to expect them to be able to take a handgun out or any sort of weapon out and fire it and do so accurately is just it's a pipe dream. And I just don't see the answer being in expanding the universe of weapons and having more people with guns at schools.
Final question, Commissioner. As we see, particularly in Chicago, a lot of the guns that are found, and I believe the same applies in New York, a lot of the guns are brought in from other states. So you can have pretty tough gun control law, if you like, in New York and Chicago, as everyone knows they have. But actually, it can often be superfluous to a criminal who can just get in a car and go to a neighboring state with much more lax gun control law. Can any of these laws, from a law enforcement perspective, can any of them be properly effective if they are not federal laws?
90% of the guns that we confiscate here on the streets of New York City are coming from out of state. We call it the iron pipeline up I-95, coming from southern states to a great extent. There's a trial going on now. A police officer who was shot and killed last year, his gun was purchased in Virginia, and it's typical of the guns that we encounter on the street. So you're correct. Unless we have a comprehensive national strategy, we're going to have a patchwork approach. New York certainly now has the strongest gun control laws in the country, and that's a good thing. But unless other states start to adopt that, we're still going to be plagued by the out-of-state flow of guns, just the reality of urban life.
And to politicians out there who are feeling that although their conscience may dictate that they agree with new gun control laws, their political aspirations may be too damaged by the gun lobbyists, NRA and others, in terms of being able to win their seats or to retain their seats. What do you say to them as somebody who yourself has shown a lot of courage, I believe, in running the police force of your city? Is it time for more politicians to show a bit of backbone and a bit of personal courage over this, rather than worrying about their political futures?
Yeah, I don't think it's too much to ask our elected officials to vote your conscience. That's why we put them in office. So, the fact that whether or not you're going to be reelected, we understand it's a human reaction. But we'd like to think that sometimes people are going to just do the right thing. And I certainly believe that's what has to happen here. There's still way too much bloodshed. And quite frankly, these are, for the most part, in most cities, young men of color who their lives are being wasted for sometimes the silliest of reasons. So, yeah, we need those politicians to stand up and do the right thing.
Commissioner Ray Kelly, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Piers.
Coming up, a different perspective on guns in America, the mayor of a small town that depends on a gun factory to survive.
With officers laid off and furloughed, simply calling 911 and waiting is no longer your best option. You can beg for mercy from a violent criminal, hide under the bed, or you can fight back. But are you prepared? Consider taking a certified safety course in handling a firearm so you can defend yourself until we get there. You have a duty to protect yourself and your family. We're partners now. Can I count on you?
That's the Sheriff of Milwaukee telling residents to learn how to defend themselves with a gun. But is that really the answer? Well, joining me now is Stephen Latourette, a former congressman and gun advocate, who says it is time for a national conversation about gun control. Also, John Stevens, the mayor of Ilion in New York, where a Remington gun factory employs 1,200 of all the town's 8,000 residents. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, if I may, Mayor Stevens. You just heard from Ray Kelly, the police commissioner in New York. Very, very strong there about the answer to this gun epidemic in America is not to have more guns out there. He wants an assault weapons ban. He wants heavy restrictions now on handguns, including background checks, et cetera, et cetera. What is your reaction to that? Because you're in a place not far from New York itself where Remington has a big factory and they make a lot of money for that area.
Yeah, my reaction to that is we need to slow down the entire process. We need to step back. We need to think about things. We can't have this knee-jerk reaction that's been going on. From my perspective, as the chief executive officer of the Village of Ilion, which houses Remington Arms, and it has for almost the past 200 years, my concern is keeping that alive and the job retention and the economic development of Remington within the Village of Ilion, New York.
See, Congressman Latourette, here's the thing about this debate, is that when I heard the sheriff there of Milwaukee, I didn't find myself furiously disagreeing with him. I've never disagreed with an American's right to defend themselves at home or to own a handgun or a pistol or a shotgun to do that. My issue is that there are not enough background checks. It's ridiculous that 40% of all gun trades in America have no background checks. I think there's serious issues about the lack of funding into mental health. And I also see no reason to have assault weapons in civilian hands. It's a very different premise, I think, from the one that the gun rights lobbyists tend to try and frame you as, which is, I'm just anti-guns, because that's not an accurate reflection. How does this debate move forward And I speak to somebody who I know you got an A rating from the NRA, so you clearly said the right kind of things from their point of view. How do we get this debate to the correct place where real action can be done that will have real effect on curbing gun violence?
Well, that's exactly the $64,000 question. What happens in Washington, typically on any issue, immigration, guns, is that everybody wants 100% in their position represented. The things that you outlined, with the exception of the assault weapons ban that I'll be happy to talk about later, but the gun show loophole is substantial, because if you look at these mass shootings that have occurred, almost all of them, except for one recently, was committed by a young white man, late teens, early 20s, who had untreated mental illness. And you get to that problem two ways. One, I thought the sheriff from Iowa did a great job of explaining most county jails today have more mental health patients, but they're not dealing with mental health. They're just warehousing them. The second thing is that if 40% of the guns are purchased at gun shows with no background check, it's not easy, but that's one way to make sure that guns aren't winding up in the hands of people that the law says shouldn't have them already.
Right, but these things seem to me to be absolutely obvious, and I can't understand why they're not already in place, and I assume that they will get somewhere with those. But in terms of the assault weapons ban, you know, I'm surprised at the number of people, and I heard a couple of police chiefs there saying they didn't really see any need to remove any guns from the equation. The problem is that the number of guns in circulation is increasing at a dramatic rate, really dramatic. I mean, the FBI had record background checks in December, as I said to Ray Kelly, following Sandy Hook. And the reason, I'm afraid, is that the NRA and other gun lobby groups who are supported by the gun industry go out, they raise fear, they say that everybody needed to have a gun, so people go and buy guns. And the only people that really win there are the gun manufacturers who make guns and ammunition, who just record profits. And that cannot be right for any civilized society.
Well, but here's the deal. There's 300 million guns in circulation roughly in the United States. There's about 300 million people, so everybody has a gun. When you talk about bans and you talk about stopping this and stopping that, it really is a drop in the bucket. I mean, there's 3.5 million of these assault weapons out there, and 3 or 4 have been used to commit horrible, horrible crimes. And so even if you said tomorrow you're not going to be able to purchase one of these weapons and put the people in Ilion out of work or whatever you do, you're not solving the problem. The way you solve the problem
but don't you have to start somewhere?
No,
and
see, that's a false. I don't accept that. I don't accept that.
Really?
Because, yeah, I don't accept that you have to start someplace, but you need to start someplace if you're going to make a difference. But to start someplace just to start someplace is foolish. And, you know, and what happens is, and this is what I'm talking about overreach, there are things that can be accomplished in a bipartisan way that would make a real difference on gun violence in the United States of America, but one side or the other will dig in their heels, draw a line in the sand, and won't get to that common ground. If you could deal with mental health and the gun show loophole, get it out of here, and then fight about the other stuff the next year or whatever, you'd be accomplishing more than an assault weapon ban, which wouldn't have one spit of difference in violent crime in America, because 3.5 million are still out there, and you'd never get it passed. And it's not, you know, people like to say, oh, it's the gun lobby and it's Republicans. Harry Reid, the leader of the Senate, the Democratic leader of the Senate, has indicated that the assault weapon ban would not even make it to the floor in the Senate because he has 5 Democratic senators from red states that can't afford to address the assault weapon ban with an election coming up.
Right, but look, okay, but look, you see, when you say that, and I don't dispute that for a second, I just think those 5 that he's talking about are just showing utter political and moral cowardice. As Ray Kelly said, it is time for them to stand up and vote on their conscience, not on political expediency, isn't it?
Well, you know, that's supposing that the conscience tells them that that's the right thing to do. Where this argument gets
I agree with that. I agree with that. But the way you phrased it yourself, you and I both believe that probably what is underpinning that situation is a political fear that they will be driven out of their seats.
Well, a political fear in that that's what their constituents want them to do. I mean, that's the second half of the equation that the commissioner left out, is you may have a conscience, but if the people that you represent don't want you to do something, well, then you're really not their representative, are you? But the Second Amendment is a tricky business.
Actually, I don't agree with that. I actually don't agree with that. I think that actually real political leadership is sometimes telling the people who have elected you things they may not necessarily feel comfortable hearing. And that's my problem with this whole debate, is that I think there are far too many American politicians, actually, who exactly agree with what you just said. Let me just turn to you, if I may, Mayor Stevens. I mean, do you agree with this? I mean, this is not an unusual view that I've heard in the last few weeks. But do you agree that the answer to gun violence is categorically not to reduce the volume of guns in circulation?
Yes, I do agree. Since the federal assault ban was expired in 2004, the national crime rates actually decreased by 17%. It's now at the lowest levels since the early 70s. So I don't think that the increase in weapons production has had any effect on increasing violent crime.
And yet you're aware that obviously every country that has brought in tough gun control, almost without exception around the world, from Japan to Australia to Britain, has seen dramatic reduction in the amount of gun murders and gun-related crime.
Right, but if you look at the United States isn't even in the top 10 of leaders in the category of violent crimes, Piers.
Okay, well, Mayor Stevens and Stephen Latourette, thank you both very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A lot of people were surprised to hear that the President skeet shoots at Camp David. When we come back, I want to talk about that and more with a couple of my favourite panellists. It'll get pretty lively.
If law enforcement officials who are dealing with this stuff every single day can come to some basic consensus in terms of steps that we need to take, Congress is going to be paying attention to them and we'll be able to make progress.
President Obama, just before today's White House meeting on guns, to remember to talk about that is Dana Loesch, the host of The Dana Show, and Charles Blow, a New York Times columnist and CNN contributor. I'm also bringing back the former Congressman Stephen Latourette. Because, Stephen, you were about to make a point about the Second Amendment, and in the interest of fair play, I'd like you to make that point.
That's nice of you. What I was saying is that, you know, the Second Amendment's been interpreted by the Supreme Court recently in a Washington, D.C. case, Heller, and another case in Chicago, looking at gun regulations. And you can't frame the argument, why do you need that gun? That's not the issue. The issue is that the Second Amendment says you're entitled to have that gun. It also, the courts have said that you can put reasonable restrictions on that. And this is a political problem that we're facing. And so people can take the extreme views on this issue and get nothing done. Or you can say, how can we come together and close the gun show loophole and do more background checks and deal with people with mental illness? I get that point. Well, I don't disagree with that second point that you made there. But on the question of the Second Amendment, I got into this with Newt Gingrich the other day. Presumably, I mean, do you agree or disagree with the ban on machine guns, for example, automatic machine guns? Well, that's a reasonable restriction. That's what I'm saying. But you can't. The reason that gun sales go up.
My question.
Yeah,
right, but my question is, since the Founding Fathers never specified, obviously, the precise type of gun, because they couldn't have done, they wouldn't have been able to foresee them. Right. My question to you is, what is the substantive difference between the effect of a banned machine gun that you and I both agree should be banned under the Second Amendment? Right. What is the difference between that and what it can do to a classroom full of children and an AR-15 loaded with a 100-bullet magazine? Because to me, I don't see any difference, and that's why I don't understand why you're comfortable with banning one but not the other.
Well, it's not a question of what I'm comfortable with. I mean, the Founding Fathers didn't foresee texting while driving either, but that isn't how we measure things. The fact of the matter is that the recent interpretations of the Second Amendment said that you're allowed to have a gun. And what you have to do then say is, what can we do within the political framework, the fractured political framework, where Republicans control the House, the Democrats control the White House and the Senate? What can you get done?
I get that. Yeah.
Well, so that's what this is about.
I get that, except that I just think that it should also include an assault weapons ban, and I'm interested in exploring the debates on both sides about that. Charles Blow, sure. I mean, this is the contradiction that I can't quite work out in my head with the pro-gun lobby, if you like. Let's call them that, even though I'm not anti-all-gun. It's a pointless phrase in many ways. But what is the difference between agreeing that under the Second Amendment you can't own a machine gun because it causes mass carnage in a few seconds, but you can apparently, as a right, have an AR-15 with a 100-bullet magazine? Can you explain to me the argument, the logic that differentiates those two in terms of the carnage they can both cause?
You can't ask me to explain the logic of differentiation because I don't quite understand the logic of those. I do believe that we can start by saying that high-capacity magazines are probably not things that we should have in civilian hands. I think that we can say that weapons like these, assault weapons, assault rifles, both, but I think also some assault handguns can be placed out of bounds of ordinary citizens, and I think that that's okay and still within the Second Amendment and does not violate the spirit of that amendment.
Okay, Dana Loesch, I mean, I spoke to Ray Kelly actually off camera at the end of that to try and just, because I knew that you and I have locked horns about this before, and I said, explain to me the difference between an AR-15 in reality and some of the more high-powered handguns. And he said, look, if you get a 30-bullet magazine clipped to a high-powered handgun, it can obviously fire at rapid rate, and everyone concedes that. The difference with an AR-15 is that the way that you hold it and the way that you load the magazines makes it a much easier weapon to commit mass slaughter with and a much faster one to commit it with. So he said there is a substantive difference. But I ask you the same question I've asked others, which is, what is the difference in terms of the argument that you're putting forward to me about your resistance to ban an AR-15 style weapon? What is the difference between the kind of carnage it can cause in a school and a machine gun, an automatic rifle, which is already banned in most places? What's the difference?
Well, an AR-15 is semi-automatic, Piers, and a machine gun is obviously automatic. So one is select fire, the other, or one may have select fire capabilities. The other one, you, with one, pull the trigger once and you get one bullet. There's a huge difference. And I want to make a note about the magazine size.
But that wasn't my question. That wasn't my question. My question was in terms...
Well, no, I explained the difference to you. You asked what the difference was.
Well, no, but I know the technical differences. I'm asking about the effect if a man like James Holmes walks into a movie theatre armed with, as he had, a 100-bullet magazine and an AR-15 and begins to unload, what is the difference in the carnage that he can cause in a minute compared to a machine gun? Now, the only answer is a few more dead, right? Because he still managed to hit 70 people.
Well, we had the Virginia Tech shooting, which was done with handguns. By the way, I've never heard the term assault handgun before. But that Virginia Tech, that was the single deadliest shooting in the history of this country, and that was done with handguns. But if you're trying to somehow equate AR-15s with machine guns, the two are completely different. The AR-15 is the civilian version of the M16. And in fact, I asked your producers about this, Piers. I wanted to show you something. This is actually a small size of a small size AR-15. And in fact, if you would believe it, I got this at the gas station. It is a lighter that's probably not going, oh, there it goes. It's not going to work. But see, the difference between a fully automatic, an M16, which is the military style, is that you hold the trigger. Imagine this is me holding the trigger. The ammunition, the rounds keep coming. But with a semi-automatic, you have to, with one pull of the trigger, one pull, one bullet every single time. That's the difference. And you're conflating these terms, though. And I want to make another point. You cited the 40% background check. That's a bunk number. That is a completely false number. You're citing a study done on 250 people back before the Brady Act, back in during the Clinton administration.
Dana, stop talking for a moment.
Just wanted to correct that.
We'll come to that after the break, but on that particular point, I know the difference technically between the M16 and the AR-15 completely. My brother uses the M16 in the Army. The point is the difference in the carnage they can cause in 1 minute in a school. I don't see much difference, and that's why I'm bemused that you believe one is entitled under your rights, but the other you're perfectly happy not to be entitled under your rights. Let's take a break. Let's come back and discuss this further, because it is a lively debate. Back now with Dana Loesch, host of The Dana Show, and Charles Blow, New York Times columnist and CNN contributor. Dana, let me ask you, I asked you this before, and you said nothing, but now you've had time to think about this. What would you personally do and authorise Washington's politicians to do to curb gun violence in America?
To curb gun violence in America, stop disarming law-abiding citizens. That's the first thing I would do.
Other than not removing any guns, what would you do to stop the fact that 18,000 Americans kill themselves with guns every year, 12,000 murder with guns every year, and 100,000
And Piers, that's a fraction. That's a fraction of people who have firearms, and you can't you can't just dump law-abiding gun owners in with criminals. I think that's really offensive to
so what would you,
a lot of Americans,
Dana,
especially when you consider 2.7 million firearms sold December of 2012.
What would you do? What would you personally do and authorize politicians to do to reduce gun violence?
To reduce gun violence, like I said, first and foremost, I would stop regulations that seek to disarm law-abiding citizens. I would also, in addition to that, that's actually one of the most important things you can do, because concealed carry, first off, whenever concealed carry is implemented, like for instance Florida or
but Dana, other than keeping guns,
that's a huge thing,
Dana,
Piers. Why you
Dana,
need to know
other than keeping Dana, other than keeping guns in people's hands, I've got your point on that. What would you proactively do to reduce gun violence?
Tougher penalties for criminals who kill people with illegally obtained firearms.
Okay, Charles Blow. This is my problem, you see, with this debate. Is it the president came out with all these? I'm asking Charles. The president came out with all these plans and all these initiatives, but many Republicans and many gun rights people simply don't agree with any of them. They don't even think there should be background checks.
Right, and first of all, we should make clear that none of those suggestions or proposals were to disarm any law-abiding gun owners. None of them. The government has not said that they want to do that and is not doing that. The second thing is that the NRA is basically a no-regulation organization. They don't want any new regulations of any sort. And none of the gun, I don't call them gun rights groups, I call them gun proliferation groups, because that is the business that they're in, is to make sure that there are more guns produced, sold, and in public hands. And I think that pushing in that direction is actually the wrong direction for us to go, because they will there will be people, most people who buy a gun will use it responsibly. But the more guns that are out there, the more likely guns will be able to fall into the hands of criminals, and that becomes the problem.
Okay, well, the debate will carry on. I'm sure that I'll have you both back very soon. Dana Loesch and Charles Blow, thank you both very much, and we'll be right back after the break. That's it for us tonight, and a programming night. Anderson Cooper hosts a special town hall on guns this Thursday night, and Anderson starts now.